tonight our speaker is Frank Almada, and so to give you some background on Dr. Almada's background, he's currently the chairman and the senior curator of botany at the California Academy of Sciences, and he's worked there since 1978. His interests include using flowering plants to address questions about plant biodiversity, biogeography, and evolution. And he's also interested in investigating why some families of flowering plants are so species-rich and examining the factors that have promoted this diversification. His research has really focused on tropical plants, and he's organized and led lots of tours down to Mexico, Central America, South America, and Madagascar. And closer to home, he has been very involved in teaching about our local flora, and has published a book in 2007 called Flora of Marin County, and he put that out with two of his colleagues from the California Native Plant Society. So welcome, Dr. Almada.
Thank you. I'll drink some water for all the speakers. Thank you, and thank you, Arvind, for the invitation last year. We met last year, wasn't it, when you were at the Academy of Sciences? Arvind was with a small group at the Academy of Sciences, and I toured them on the living roof. And afterwards, we had a little extra time, and I said, well, would you like to go behind the scenes, and I'll take you to my department? And I think they were really quite interested in what they were seeing. So at the end of that, he said, would you come and talk to our chapter in Santa Clara? I said, well, of course. So my wife and I were away just recently in Australia attending an international botanical congress. And while I was away, Judy had sent me a message saying, well, let's see, you're going to be talking about research at the Academy. And I had just been working on this presentation about Madagascar. So I'm going to take you to a place that's very far away from home. And I suspect that what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is going to be somewhat of a departure from what your programs are typically like, because you probably hear mostly about plants. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about plants, but I'm also going to be telling you about a lot of the animals that occur in that fantastic island of Madagascar. First and foremost, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about islands. And the reason I want to tell you about islands is because the California Academy of Sciences has had a very long history of sending our researchers to island ecosystems around the world. As a matter of fact, in 1906, just after the 1906 earthquake, and which destroyed practically the entire museum that we were in on Market Street, as well as all of our collections except the type collections, which was largely a collection of California native plants, which we still have. We have about over 1,400 specimens that Alice Eastwood saved, and they're still with us. So that was probably the only thing from the old museum that we saved. And she saved one stuffed bird. That's a bird that occurs off the coast of Mexico, which is now extinct in the wild. So we have the only specimen. So the Galapagos Islands, we had this group in the Galapagos Islands on a major expedition. They'd been there for about a year. And just after the earthquake, they came into the Golden Gate and basically deposited the nucleus of what became our new museum research holdings. And since that time, the Academy has had a long history of sending our researchers to other islands around the world, islands in the Gulf of California, islands in the Pacific, places like Papua New Guinea, Borneo, Philippines, Gulf of Guinea off the west coast of Africa. And in the last 15 years or so, we've also spent a lot of time in a place like Madagascar. So I'd like to start by just telling you that I first went to Madagascar about 18 years ago, and I went with a group of like-minded friends. It was about 8 of us. We spent about a month there, just sort of a look and see. The reason I wanted to go to Madagascar is because when I was a kid, I remember reading an article in the National Geographic about Madagascar and its incredible spiny forest and the big elephant birds, and I thought at the time, gosh, I want to go there someday. So I was able to encourage some of my friends to join me, and we spent a month just sort of look and see. And it was both a very elating experience and a very depressing experience. Elating because one sees there organisms that are just out of this world. But at the same time, it was a bit depressing because there had been a tremendous amount of destruction that had gone on. That's true of so many developing countries around the world. Those of us who spend most of our time here in North America, and especially here in California, where we're so conservation-minded about our flora and fauna, it's not like that around the world. But nevertheless, I tell people we can't lose faith. We have to keep the faith, because you don't mourn what's been lost, but you celebrate what they still have and try to help them save it. So let me tell you a little bit then about Madagascar. I like to call it naturalist paradise, and I think by the time I finish talking this evening, you'll understand why. This is the national highway as it was when I was there in 1993. That's the major highway that takes you from Antananarivo, the capital, all the way down to Tuliar, which is the major port city on the Mozambique Channel. Now, this road is now paved, and it's now very easy. A trip that used to take about a full day to get from the capital down to the coast, you can now do probably in about 5 or 6 hours. Okay, so why are islands so interesting? Everybody tends to have an idea of what islands are. Scholars usually define them as islands as isolated habitats that are surrounded by other habitats that are dramatically different. But for example, an island is not necessarily a piece of land that is always surrounded by water, but you can have a high mountain that's surrounded by a desert. And in effect, that island or that mountain is a kind of island. And we have island environments around the world of all kinds. And they're interesting because all of them have greater or lesser degrees of isolation. And it's the isolation that's the key factor that really contributes to the very uniqueness of most islands. Now, this isolation, when you're in an ocean setting, can be achieved in 2 ways. New volcanoes can arise from the seafloor to create what we call oceanic islands, things like Hawaii, things like Galapagos Islands. Or you can get global plate tectonics that fragment over time and create what we call continental islands. And the island I'm going to talk to you about today, Madagascar, is what we call a continental island. I like to think of a continental island as essentially a chip off the old block. It was one time attached to a major continental landmass and then became isolated at some time in its history.
Like New Zealand.
I'm sorry?
Like New Zealand.
Exactly, exactly.
Would you like the lights down?
It would help just a little bit. I'm going to move this over here. It'll be a little easier.
Oh, yes, what a difference.
Is that better?
Yes.
It's clearer? Okay. Okay, so why study islands? I tell people that islands are really interesting because they really command the attention and curiosity of scientists, as I said, because of their isolation, and the fact that isolation, the effects of isolation have really been important in uncovering all kinds of biological processes that are pertinent in understanding the evolution of these organisms. And more so than not, if you go to islands around the world, very often they're characterized by some very extraordinary life forms. And these life forms are both of the plant and animal type. It involves everything from organisms that are giant to things that are dwarf, to things that are what I say as being nonconformist in every way. Here are just a few of them. The big baobabs, chameleons. Can anybody tell me what that is?
This is a flower?
Huh?
This is a flower?
It's a flower, but a lot of people think it's a marine organism. It's actually a milkweed. It's actually an endemic milkweed that occurs in Madagascar, and these are the stems, and they look like part of the stony background that it grows in, and you only notice it when it's flowering. So that flower is about that big around. And a gentleman who actually collected that's Staphylianthus madagascariensis, and a gentleman who lived he was Swiss, he lived in southern Madagascar around the town of Tuliar. He gave me a piece of that when I was there in 1996, and I've been growing it for all those years, but it's never flowered, and I think part of the reason is that I can't give it enough heat. I live in the East Bay up north of Berkeley in the Bay Area, and if I grew it outside, it probably wouldn't make it through the winter. So that's why it probably hasn't gotten enough heat.
What time of the year does it flower?
In the wild, it typically flowers about September.
Frank.
Okay. Another reason islands are so interesting is that everyone is a unique evolutionary laboratory. And in trying to understand why every island is unique, you need to consider these factors. You have to know something about the age, the size and habitat diversity, the isolation, and its proximity to other land masses. All of these factors in aggregate determine what plants and animals occur on these islands. For example, age, the older an island is, the better, because it's had a lot more time to actually recruit organisms, things that have actually gotten there on their own. The size and habitat diversity, we know that for a fact by just looking here in our own home state. California is very diverse topographically, and because of its topographic diversity, we have undoubtedly a richer flora than practically every other state in the Union, because we have a lot of ecological niches that can be filled. Isolation, for islands at least, remoteness really fosters the formation of species, and not only the formation of species, but the maintenance of things like endemic species, species that have a very restricted distribution, and relics. Relics being things that are very old from the ancient past, for example, like our redwoods. They're relics that at one point had much wider distributions. And of course, proximity to land masses. An island like Madagascar, which is about 250 miles now east of the African continent, received a great number of species, both plant and animal, from that continent that subsequently differentiated. Now let's give you Madagascar at a glance. The island is really, as I said, about 250 miles off the coast of Africa in the western Indian Ocean. It's just south of the equator. It's fairly large. It's over 226,000 square miles. Just to give you a comparison, that would be about the size of California and Washington State put together. So it's quite a large island. It's actually the fourth largest island in the world. The highest point is just over 9,000 feet. Because most of it is in the tropics, it has a tropical climate with most of the rain falling between December and March. And these are some of the human statistics, 19 million people. My wife and I were away just recently in Australia attending an International Botanical Congress. And while I was away, Judy had sent me a message saying, well, let's see, you're going to be talking about research at the Academy. And I had just been working on this presentation about Madagascar. So I'm going to take you to a place that's very far away from home. And I suspect that what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is going to be somewhat of a departure from what your programs are typically like, because you probably hear mostly about plants. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about plants, but I'm also going to be telling you about a lot of the animals that occur in that fantastic island of Madagascar. First and foremost, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about islands. And the reason I want to tell you about islands is because the California Academy of Sciences has had a very long history of sending our researchers to island ecosystems around the world. As a matter of fact, in 1906, just after the 1906 earthquake, which destroyed practically the entire museum that we were in on Market Street, as well as all of our collections except the type collections, which was largely a collection of California native plants, which we still have. We have about over 1,400 specimens that Alice Eastwood saved, and they're still with us. So that was probably the only thing from the old museum that we saved. And she saved one stuffed bird. That's a bird that occurs off the coast of Mexico, which is now extinct in the wild. So we have the only specimen. So the Galapagos Islands, we had this group in the Galapagos Islands on a major expedition. They'd been there for about a year. And just after the earthquake, they came into the Golden Gate and basically deposited the nucleus of what became our new museum research holdings. And since that time, the Academy has had a long history of sending our researchers to other islands around the world, islands in the Gulf of California, islands in the Pacific, places like Papua New Guinea, Borneo, Philippines, Gulf of Guinea off the west coast of Africa. And in the last 15 years or so, we've also spent a lot of time in a place like Madagascar. So I'd like to start by just telling you that I first went to Madagascar about 18 years ago, and I went with a group of like-minded friends. It was about 8 of us. We spent about a month there, just sort of a look and see. The reason I wanted to go to Madagascar is because when I was a kid, I remember reading an article in the National Geographic about Madagascar and its incredible spiny forest and the big elephant birds, and I thought at the time, gosh, I want to go there someday. So I was able to encourage some of my friends to join me, and we spent a month just sort of look and see. And it was both a very elating experience and a very depressing experience. Elating because one sees there organisms that are just out of this world, but at the same time, it was a bit depressing because there had been a tremendous amount of destruction that had gone on. That's true of so many developing countries around the world. Those of us who spend most of our time here in North America, and especially here in California, where we're so conservation-minded about our flora and fauna, it's not like that around the world. But nevertheless, I tell people, we can't lose faith. We have to keep the faith because you don't mourn what's been lost, but you celebrate what they still have and try to help them save it. So let me tell you a little bit then about Madagascar. I like to call it naturalist paradise, and I think by the time I finish talking this evening, you'll understand why. This is the national highway as it was when I was there in 1993. That's the major highway that takes you from Antananarivo, the capital, all the way down to Tuliar, which is the major port city on the Mozambique Channel. Now, this road is now paved, and it's now very easy. A trip that used to take about a full day to get from the capital down to the coast, you can now do probably in about 5 or 6 hours. Okay, so why are islands so interesting? Everybody tends to have an idea of what islands are. Scholars usually define them as islands as isolated habitats that are surrounded by other habitats that are dramatically different. But for example, an island is not necessarily a piece of land that is always surrounded by water, but you can have a high mountain that's surrounded by a desert, and in effect, that island or that mountain is a kind of island. And we have island environments around the world of all kinds. And they're interesting because all of them have greater or lesser degrees of isolation. And it's the isolation that's the key factor that really contributes to the very uniqueness of most islands. Now, this isolation, when you're in an ocean setting, can be achieved in two ways. New volcanoes can arise from the seafloor to create what we call oceanic islands, things like Hawaii, things like Galapagos Islands. Or you can get global plate tectonics that fragment over time and create what we call continental islands. And the island I'm going to talk to you about today, Madagascar, is what we call a continental island. I like to think of a continental island as essentially a chip off the old block. It was one time attached to a major continental landmass and then became isolated at some time in its history.
Like New Zealand.
I'm sorry?
Like New Zealand.
Exactly, exactly.
Would you like the lights down? Would that be
It would help just a little bit. I'm going to move this over here. It'll be a little easier.
Oh, yes, what a difference.
Is that better?
Yes.
It's clear? Okay. Okay, so why study islands? I tell people that islands are really interesting because they really command the attention and curiosity of scientists, as I said, because of their isolation. And the fact that isolation, the effects of isolation have really been important in uncovering all kinds of biological processes that are pertinent in understanding the evolution of these organisms. And more so than not, if you go to islands around the world, very often they're characterized by some very extraordinary life forms. And these life forms are both of the plant and animal type. It involves everything from organisms that are giant to things that are dwarf, to things that are what I say as being nonconformist in every way. Here are just a few of them. The big baobabs, chameleons. Can anybody tell me what that is?
This is a flower?
Huh?
Is it a flower?
It's a flower, but a lot of people think it's a marine organism. It's actually a milkweed. It's actually an endemic milkweed that occurs in Madagascar, and these are the stems, and they look like part of the stony background that it grows in, and you only notice it when it's flowering. So that flower is about that big around. And a gentleman who actually collected that's Staphylianthus madagascariensis, and A gentleman who lived he was Swiss, he lived in southern Madagascar around the town of Tuliar. He gave me a piece of that when I was there in 1996, and I've been growing it for all those years, but it's never flowered, and I think part of the reason is that I can't give it enough heat. I live in the East Bay up north of Berkeley in the Bay Area, and if I grew it outside, it probably wouldn't make it through the winter. So that's why it probably hasn't gotten enough heat.
What time of the year does it flower?
In the wild, it typically flowers about September.
So spring.
Okay. Another reason islands are so interesting is that everyone is a unique evolutionary laboratory. And in trying to understand why every island is unique, you need to consider these factors. You have to know something about the age, the size and habitat diversity, the isolation, and its proximity to other land masses. All of these factors in aggregate determine what plants and animals occur on these islands. For example, age, the older an island is, the better, because it's had a lot more time to actually recruit organisms, things that have actually gotten there on their own. The size and habitat diversity, we know that for a fact by just looking here in our own home state. California is very diverse topographically, and because of its topographic diversity, we have undoubtedly a richer flora than practically every other state in the Union, because we have a lot of ecological niches that can be filled. Isolation, for islands at least, remoteness really fosters the formation of species, and not only the formation of species, but the maintenance of things like endemic species that have a very restricted distribution, and relics. Relics being things that are very old from the ancient past, for example, like our redwoods. They're relics that at one point had much wider distributions. And of course, proximity to land masses. An island like Madagascar, which is about 250 miles now east of the African continent, received a great number of species, both plant and animal, from that continent that subsequently differentiated. Now let's give you Madagascar at a glance. The island is really, as I said, about 250 miles off the coast of Africa in the western Indian Ocean. It's just south of the equator. It's fairly large. It's over 226,000 square miles. Just to give you a comparison, that would be about the size of California and Washington State put together. So it's quite a large island. It's actually the fourth largest island in the world. The highest point is just over 9,000 feet. Because most of it is in the tropics, it has a tropical climate with most of the rain falling between December and March. And these are some of the human statistics. 19 million people, fairly high annual population growth, life expectancy, chief products. And this is probably one of the most interesting things. It's only been populated by humans for the past 2,300 years. And there are very, very few islands in the world that was actually populated so late in the history of our planet. Now, I have this quote that I always like to present when I talk about Madagascar because I think it's very telling. This gentleman by the name of Philibert Commerson in 1771, he took a trip to Madagascar. And he said, "May I announce to you that Madagascar is the naturalist's promised land? Nature seems to have retreated there into a private sanctuary where she could work on different models from any she had used elsewhere. There you meet bizarre and marvelous forms at every step." And it's just beautifully said, but it's so true. For example, here is a beetle that's called a giraffe beetle because the male has an extremely long neck. The female doesn't, but the male does. And not only does it have unique physical characteristics, but it also has a very specific habitat requirement. It actually requires the leaf of this particular princess flower. Do any of you know the tibuchinas that we grow here, Tibuchina orwelliana, the big beautiful purple flowers? Madagascar has about 350 species in that family, and this beetle requires the leaves of only one species in that genus, and there are about 25 different species in Madagascar, but it requires the leaf of one to roll up and lay its eggs. It won't do it in any other species. It just shows that beautiful, tightly coevolutionary relationship that's evolved. And then presently, here in 2011, we can still say that Madagascar is a world apart. because there is really no other landmass in the world of equivalent size that really surpasses its level of species richness and endemism at different taxonomic levels, whether it be plants or animals. And it's really a unique evolutionary experiment. It's a living laboratory unlike any other place on Earth. Of course, if you travel to other islands of the world, you can say this for many other islands as well, because every one has been a unique evolutionary experiment. Some of those that are most unique and most interesting tend to lie in the tropics. Let me just give you an idea of some of the physiographic diversity of Madagascar. The island can be divided into about 3 regions. The eastern region, the eastern region, which is sort of denoted by the green here. This is the oldest part of the island geographically. It's really a Precambrian basement of metamorphic rocks. Vegetationally, that's primarily very humid, wet, tropical rainforest. It has the highest rainfall throughout the island. And the mean summer temperature is over about 27 degrees centigrade. Now, if you have difficulty in thinking in centigrade, 30 degrees centigrade is about 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a fairly warm temperature, average temperature. The western area, which would be delimited about like here, everything to the west of that line, is much younger geologically. It's all sedimentary rock, some of which at one point was actually under the water. And its vegetational cover is a deciduous forest that actually loses its leaves for a major part of the year. And as you go from the north to south, you get a significant drying trend, so that in this part of the island, you have what is called the spiny forest. And I'll show you some images of that in a while. That is the area that, although there are no native cacti anywhere in Madagascar of the spiny type, there are things there that look very much like cacti in the Western Hemisphere. And then we have the Central Plateau, which is this area here. And that constitutes about 40% of the island. And because it's been modified by human activity for so long, we don't really know what the natural vegetation was, but we suspect, based on cores that have been made and paleontologists and paleobotanists, that it was probably a mosaic of different vegetation types that were meeting coming from both the west and the east. It probably was something that was woodland, sort of like our oak woodlands, interdigitating with grasslands or something of that sort. Now, one of the interesting things about Madagascar, since it was a colony, a French colony for over 60 years, from the late 1890s until about 1960, it was actually a French colony, and the French instilled in the government of Madagascar the idea of actually setting aside pieces of natural vegetation, natural environments that should be preserved. They did this as either national parks or private reserves or research reserves or what have you. And they have always used biological data to make decisions about conservation. Now, in recent years, they've also implemented a number of policies, not only to just safeguard the plants and animals, but they've also allowed humans to live in areas close to these protected areas, because the human population in Madagascar, ever since it settled there, has always used the forest and native plants and animals for various purposes. They've used them for either food, or they've used them for shelter, or they often use the forest as their pharmacy, being a developing country. The Malagasy government has made an effort to try to keep these people, to keep living in that way, but living in that way in a sustainable fashion. Nevertheless, humans can be greedy, and if you give them that opportunity, oftentimes they take it to an extreme. So we have now a problem in Madagascar. Although the government is allowing this, it could certainly benefit by making sure that there's better staffing, to make sure that a lot of these trees and animals are not poached to extreme. So, as is true throughout the developing world, law enforcement and revamping the judicial system can certainly be improved to make sure that the natural resources are protected in better ways. Now, I have here just a map that shows a number of the different reserves, and you can see that they're pretty much placed strategically throughout the country, not only in the east, but also in the west, and even a few in the center. Now I'm going to run through a series of images here that show some of the protected areas, most of which are national parks. I have one image that I've taken in that park, the name of the park up at the top, and the date in parentheses is the date in which that park was actually established. I think you'll be amazed at how so many of them have actually been established fairly recently. For example, this one is Andasibe National Park that preserves a fairly low elevation rainforest on the east coast about midway up the island. And it was only established in 1989. Montandambre, this is one of the old volcanic areas, a very beautiful park that's pretty much an island of that's about 4,000 feet elevation, but pretty much everything around it has been destroyed. Beautiful canyons, nice waterfalls and what have you. That one was established in 1958. Andringatra National Park, one of my absolute favorites. It's about midway down the peninsula. It consists of a habitat that's studded with these granite outcrops that we call Inselbergs, these rock islands. And in fact, this environment is actually an environment that's a remnant of the very old basement rock of Gondwanaland. As a matter of fact, if you go to other parts of the world, like India or Africa or Brazil, you see these same exposed granite formations, and they're part of that old, eroded, ancient landmass. It was established only in 1999. Singi de Bemaraha, this is probably the only site in all of Madagascar, the only natural area that's been set aside as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's an area that consists of these wonderful razor-sharp pinnacles. This is all limestone that at one time was under the water, has been uplifted, and has experienced millions of years of erosion by wind and water. It's a very difficult environment to move around in, but it's a very exhilarating place to visit. One can't help be impressed when you're on a bridge like this and you're looking down at something like this, and you can see the lemurs just hopping from pinnacle to pinnacle. It's remarkable. Bereni Private Reserve. Bereni Private Reserve was actually started by a family, a French family that had been living in Mauritius, and they moved to Madagascar in the early 1920s, and they bought a piece of property along a river. So what they've done is, it's in the southwest, so much of the vegetation is this wonderful spiny forest, but they've also preserved a gallery forest that's along one of the major rivers. And that gallery forest is home to a number of lemurs, several species, the most notable of which are the ringtail lemurs.
What is a gallery?
A gallery forest is like a riparian forest. You know, we have what are called riparian forests along a river stream. Okay. Ranamafan National Park is another rainforest park, but unlike the first one that I showed you, it's fairly far down on the island. But again, it's about 4,000 feet. The impetus for setting this aside as a national park is that a very unusual bamboo-eating lemur was discovered there in the late 80s by my colleague Pat Wright and her German colleagues. And it was totally new to science. As a matter of fact, they're still finding new species of lemurs. When I first went there in 1993, we thought there were about 39 species of lemurs. Now there are probably over 80 species of lemurs that have been discovered all total. So it just goes to show you it's an island that's still very little explored in many ways. Lake Simanapetsa National Park also started in 1999. It's a soda lake. So the soda lake is not terribly rich in aquatic life, but it's a wonderful place for nesting flamingos. There are 2 species of flamingos that actually nest on this lake. And the vegetation surrounding the lake is beautiful western deciduous forest, but with intermingling with spiny forest.
Is that tree like the ones from Africa
No,
That's one.
this tree is actually a member of the legume family. I don't know if any of you know the tree that's called flamboyant. Flamboyant is the legume that has these big, beautiful orange-red flowers. If you go to lowland Hawaii, lowland Florida, it's actually native in Madagascar, but this is another species of that genus.
Thank you.
And Isalo National Park. Isalo is another one of these unusual geologic formations. It's referred to as ruiniform sandstone. A very, very rugged topography, but with a very interesting vegetation and many endemic species that occur only there. And lastly, Mashwell National Park. Mashwell National Park is the last remaining vestige of rainforest, the most extensive vestige of fairly lowland rainforest way up in the northeastern part of the country. And again, you can see that this park was only established in 1997. And virtually every expedition that's sent into that park ends up finding species new to science, especially plants. As a matter of fact, I have in my cabinets in my office at the Academy several new species from this very park that just need to be written up. So here is just a snapshot of Madagascar's biodiversity, plants and animals. One of the things I want to sort of drive home is that 90% of all the species on the island occur in forest. But since 1950, 40% of that forest has been lost. And that means that about 14% of the species have gone extinct since 1950. So this is a fairly rapid rate of extinction. You know, if you read the literature about extinction, we're told that prior to 10,000 years ago, there would be about one species per million that would go extinct every year. Human activity around our planet now has increased that rate to about 1,000 in a million every year. And we believe that we'll soon reach the rate of making 10,000 species go extinct every year. So if you look at prior to 10,000 years ago, one species going extinct every year, and it takes about that to create a new species. But now what's happened is we've accelerated that rate of extinction, especially in tropical environments around the world, so that we're making the biota of these areas so depauperate that there's hardly a chance for them to bounce back. That's why it's really so important to set aside reserves and make sure that they're managed properly to keep these things intact. Higher plants, nearly 15,000 species. Here in California we have, what, just over 5,000, and that includes even our naturalized species, not just the native ones. Five endemic families. There are not too many islands in the world that can claim they have 5 endemic families, not genera, not species, but families. And I'll show you these in a minute. And 85% of all the species occur only there and no place else. Primates, 84 species in 5 families, 15 genera, all of which occur on Madagascar and no place else. And that's that we know that at least 16 species have actually gone extinct in the last few thousand years. Birds, not so many birds, only about 250, about 209 of which are breeding, but more than half of these are also only on Madagascar. And again, 5 endemic families and 35 endemic genera, only there on that island. Reptiles and amphibians, equally impressive. You can see the number of species that are endemic are quite high. For reptiles, 314 out of 340. For amphibians, 215 out of 217. And even the ants, and even the butterflies and dragonflies, you know, many people tend to ignore things like the insects. They tend to notice things like the colorful ones, the butterflies. But in fact, even they have very significant numbers of endemism. Now, if we look at the origins of Madagascar's biodiversity, I tell people that in order to understand the evolution of this unique assemblage of plants and animals, it's a very complicated thing, but a portion of these events that contributed to their origin, really one has to go back deep in time to understand it. As I told you earlier, Madagascar is a fragment of that former supercontinent of Gondwana, which of course included things like South America, Australia, Antarctica, India. And some people don't realize that it also included the island of Sri Lanka and portions of present-day Seychelles Islands, which are just north of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. And about 160 million years ago, Gondwana started to break up. So Madagascar and the other major components of that supercontinent started drifting apart. And India and Madagascar stayed together for the longest period of time. But about 140 million years ago, they also separated as a unit from Africa. And then 80 million years ago, India separated from Madagascar. India moved northward, and its collision with Asia, of course, created the Himalayas, and Madagascar moved east into the Indian Ocean and became an island. So Madagascar has been isolated for a large, large part of its history, which of course is one of the reasons it's so interesting, because it's been isolated for so long. So many, many groups of organisms, and things like Podocarpus, many of you know Podocarpus, we grow them here. Cycads, you know cycads, we grow them here as well. Trapdoor spiders, you probably may not be too familiar with them. Iguanid lizards and others. These were all things that occurred on Africa when Madagascar was attached. So some of them, if they were lucky or unlucky enough, ended up on that little territory. They became Madagascar and actually survived that journey. Now, after the breakup of Gondwana, different groups, and mostly from Africa, and to a lesser extent from Asia and other far-flung places, actually colonized Madagascar in a variety of ways. Now, the plants, it's easy to understand how they got to Madagascar. There were already some that were on Madagascar as it rafted away. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because if you talk to people who like studying islands, they'll tell you that for oceanic islands, those that arise out of the ocean as a result of volcanism, like Hawaii and the Galapagos Islands, it's said that they have everything to gain because they're essentially barren when they arise from the ocean. Whereas the other continental islands have everything to lose because they're going to have a lot of things that are going to come to them and may outcompete the things that were already there. So the plants actually can get there by birds that eat them, so they're in the guts of frugivores and on feathers of birds, or there may be seeds that are buoyant and can make the ocean voyage. Some of them are even salt tolerant. For things like ferns and non-seed bearing plants, the spores, as we know, are transported in the stratosphere over long distances and then can land anywhere. We know that very well because in our living roof at the Academy, we had sterilized soil that was put in with all the plants that we actually planted, native species, and guess what we have a lot of already? Lots and lots of mosses. And we know we didn't plant any of them, but they found their way by spores just landing from the stratosphere. Now for animals, the arrival of animals was a very different affair. Now, some of them probably got to Madagascar by rafting on mats of floating vegetation. Some could swim or could fly if they were insects, bats, or birds. But for the larger vertebrates, dispersal was certainly a much more difficult situation, and for the most part, it was really a very rare event. So what we end up with in an island like Madagascar, as old as it is what we call a disharmonic fauna. And for example, a disharmonic fauna lacks some groups of animals because of their very poor dispersal capability. Now, one would expect certain species to be on an island if it was close to a source area like Africa and had habitats that were similar. And actually, Madagascar has many habitats that are repeated in Africa. Africa has rainforest, Africa has dry forest, Africa has savannas. So you would expect to have a fairly good representative subset of the plants and animals from Africa on Madagascar. It does plant-wise, but it doesn't animal-wise. And it means that many of those animals just couldn't get there very easily, and many of them never got there. So The fact that some animals and plants cannot readily migrate means that they will be absent on islands. And we refer to that absence by the term disharmonic. Okay. Now, Madagascar lacks, for example, so many groups that are typical of mainland Africa. It lacks elephants, it lacks rhinoceroses, it lacks giraffes, it lacks antelopes, lions, leopards, you name it. The list just goes on and on. And this can even be extended to many different groups of birds, like woodpeckers, thrushes, hornbills, and what have you. Let's turn now to the plants, which all of us are interested in. These are the current statistics. 248 families, 29 pteridophyte families, 2 gymnosperm families, 212 flowering plant families. These are the 5 endemic families of flowering plants. Do you recognize any of those? Probably not. They're pretty esoteric groups. I've just listed them here, and you can see this is the number of genera and the number of species. Some of them have quite a few genera. This one has 10 and 68 species, and some have very few, like this one, 1 and 1. And these are what they look like. Now, if you look closely, and with a lot of studies that have been done recently with DNA sequencing, we now know exactly what these things are related to, more or less. But nevertheless, they're still so distinct that they can't be placed in any currently recognized family, so we recognize them as distinct. And the grand total, as I told you earlier, close to 15,000. And there are a number of very important signature plant groups in Madagascar. If you've ever traveled to lowland tropics in the world, Hawaii, places like Florida and other lowland tropical areas, you've undoubtedly seen what's called the traveler's palm. It's called a palm, but in fact it's not a true palm. It's actually in the Strelitziaceae family, which is the bird of paradise family. In fact, this is another one of those relic groups, because here you have one species and one genus on Madagascar. Its closest relatives are in South Africa, the genus Strelitzia, the true birds of paradise, and its other relative is in northern South America, the genus Phoenicospermum. So here you have a beautiful example of 3 distinct genera in all of the same family, but on different continents that were all connected to one another. Only recently have we been able to get a good idea of how many orchids were in Madagascar. About 2 years ago, a British orchidologist working out of Kew with colleagues at Kew put together a nice little book on a field guide to the orchids of Madagascar, and they recognized 57 genera and 1,000 species. This is just a small sampling of some of that diversity. They're really quite remarkable. Most of these are groups that just don't occur anyplace else. As a matter of fact, this here, all of you like vanilla, don't you? As a matter of fact, this is the genus Vanilla, Vanilla madagascariensis. Although it doesn't produce a pod that's edible like the one that we use. In fact, the one that we use is native to Mexico, but there are many species there, none of which have actually been exploited for their source of vanilla. Leaf succulents. Madagascar is really quite a remarkable place for leaf succulents, especially things like the kalanchoes, the aloes, more kalanchoes. I think, you know, in terms of aloe just alone, this is a pretty remarkable one. This one is about, I think I was standing next to it and it sort of towered way above me. Back about 30 years ago, we thought there were about 60 species of aloe in Madagascar, and a book has just come out on the aloes of Madagascar, and now they recognize something like 120 species. So they're still discovering new ones that are on mountaintops or on steep ridges or what have you. And the pachycol succulents. The pachycol succulents meaning those succulents that have very, very large, thick stems that are, or trunks that are water storage things. There are, what I'm showing you here are primarily species of baobab, and the baobabs are the most statuesque of their pachycol succulents. There are 6 species of baobab in Madagascar, all of which occur only there. And then there are only 2 others in the world, one of which is native to Africa and one of which is native to northwestern Australia. Many people thought that this group was also one of these ancient things that was a relic, but in fact now, with recent studies and looking at DNA analysis, we realize that it's possible that the baobabs arose in Madagascar, but the things that are in other continents probably got there via long-distance dispersal, because the fruits are like a big baseball, and they're actually covered with a sort of a thatch of felt, and they float in the water for long, long periods of time. Like the coconut, yes. And pachypodiums. If you have any friends that are succulent enthusiasts, do you have anyone that, you must know somebody who loves succulents. They go wild over this group, the pachypodiums. These are relatives of things like oleander, and they're everything from small things like this that look like a sack of potatoes, of little new potatoes that were thrown on the ground, and you only notice them when they're flowering, to things that are like this, or some that become small trees, to things like this with a very broad, almost buttressed trunk. Really a remarkable group.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned about that the fruit would float.
Yes.
Is it found only around the perimeter of the island then?
Well, we believe that it probably, or this group probably arose in Madagascar, and they occur primarily in dry forest. Did any of you ever see the movie called Madagascar? Did any of you see it? There was a movie that was sort of an interesting movie made about Madagascar, and sadly, when I saw it, I was disappointed because they had the baobab coming out of the rainforest, and you never find baobabs in Madagascar in the rainforest. They're always in the dry forest. Yeah. But now, in Australia, they do occur along the coast. In Africa, we don't know because it's been grown there for so long. And things about baobabs is they're very much valued as trees because they use every part of them. They use the strip off the bark for making rope. They feed on the leaves. They feed on the seeds and what have you. And the family Didieriaceae. This is the family that's sort of the signature group for the spiny forest. All of these look like cacti or look like the bujum. If you've ever been to Baja California, you know that group, the Fukierias, well, what used to be called Idria. They look very much like that. This at one point was thought to be a family endemic to Madagascar, especially just that dry forest in the southwest. But we now know from recent DNA sequence studies that in fact there are other things that occur in South Africa that actually belong in this group. So the family is no longer endemic to Madagascar, but all the genera and species that occur in Madagascar are endemic there. And this is just a sampling that I put together of things that I've taken on various trips to Madagascar. This is a member of the coffee family, Ixora. This is a member of the jacaranda family. This is in the sesame family. This is in the euphorb family, a euphorb. This is something, do all of you know gunnera that's grown in gardens, the things with the huge leaves? This is a family called Myrothamnaceae that has only two species, one in Madagascar and one in Africa. And now based on DNA sequence studies, we realize that this thing is very closely related to gunnera. And many, many other things, gentians, cucurbits, milkweeds. Now let me move on away from the plants and tell you a little bit about the mammals. Again, the mammals, in addition to the lemur, only 5 other major groups are found on Madagascar: the bats, the tenracs, the rats and mice, civet-like carnivores. These are the civet-like things. The fossa. This is the largest carnivore on the island. Some people think it's a cat. Some people think it's a dog. It doesn't look like either one. It's actually a creature that crawls on trees like tigers, and it feeds on things like other mongooses, and it also feeds on lemurs, sadly. It's quite large. It's about, from head to tail, it can be about 5 feet long. And then this little group of mammals called tenrecs. It's a family that's largely, they look like hedgehogs, but they're actually a group just totally restricted to Madagascar. And of course, the primates. The primates, if you're not familiar with them, are again 5 major groups: the lemurs, the lorises, which are in Southeast Asia, as are the tarsiers, the New World monkeys, the Old World simians, which of course are the monkeys, the apes, and humans. And the non-human primates, of course, are mostly tropical, and they all are pretty much forest-inhabiting creatures. Lemurs of Madagascar. Now, have any? I know some of you have been to Madagascar, but can I see a show of hands of those of you who have? Yeah, good. Not too many. But probably the lemurs are the most enchanting group of animals to really see there. It really is remarkable when you see them. Oftentimes they'll stop and they won't run away from you, but they'll look at you, and they'll look at you with eyes that are just piercing, almost making you think, don't we have a relative that we shared way back sometime? But they really are quite enchanting creatures. And they, of course, exhibit a number of really interesting adaptive features. They have very interesting dentition patterns. They're actually some of the most primitive of living primates. And we know from the fossil records that lemurs once occurred in Europe and other parts of the world, but they then went extinct there. And we suspect that the reason that they survived on places like Madagascar, and they, of course, evolved long before monkeys, but we believe that one of the reasons they survived is because monkeys really never made passage to Madagascar, so there was no competition. There were a number of habitats, there was a lot of territory, and in fact the lemurs basically radiated into this entire area. Now, the lemurs can be divided into 2 groups depending on whether they're active at night, nocturnal, or active during the day, diurnal. And they also exhibit varying foraging ranges, and they can either be solitary or some of them are very gregarious and live in social groups. And there are really 5 distinct subgroups. There's the ai, there are the sportive lemurs, the true lemurs, and the bamboo lemurs, the indri, which is the largest living lemur, and then the mouse lemurs. And I'm just going to run through a few of these just to show you what they look like.
Question?
Yes, sir.
What's dentition?
Teeth. The teeth, the pattern, the number of teeth, the kind of teeth, the size of teeth. For example, talking about dentition, the ai, when it was first described, it's now believed to be the most primitive of the lemurs. If you look at the branch of the family tree, it's the one that branches off first at the base. In fact, when it was first described, it was thought to be a rodent. But it's the oddest creature because it has ears like a bat, it has a tail like a squirrel, and it has this very long finger that it uses to actually remove grubs from trees. And it has incisor teeth that continuously grow like rodents. So it constantly has to chew and chew to keep them filed down. But it wasn't until many, many years after it was described in the scientific literature that lemur specialists realized, this is a lemur, but it's just a very odd lemur. And there's just one. It's just in its own genus, in its own family, and only one species. At one point, it was thought to be extremely rare, and it was thought to be endangered. The local people fear it, and they often would kill it. But since then, we have found that actually, because it's one of the nocturnal ones, so one has to go out at night to find it, but we've now found that, in fact, it's not so rare. It's really cropped up in populations all over the country once we've started looking for it in some detail.
Why was it feared?
It's just, I think people are just superstitious. You know how indigenous peoples can have strange superstitions about things. They feared that if you saw one, it meant one of your relatives was going to die or something like that. Who knows what the source or origin of these superstitions were? But
maybe incisors that keep growing.
yeah, that's possible. Somebody asked, do they bite? I don't know of anybody having been bitten by a lemur. In fact, some people even have them as pets. These are the sportive lemurs. The sportive lemurs are also nocturnal. You can see this one is actually in a little recess in a tree. And notice also, they have, these nocturnal creatures have very large eyes.
They're orange, too.
Yes, yes, and all these at the bottom are actually mouse lemurs, and some of these are only about so big. They look like a very miniature squirrel, really, really tiny. And in fact, many of the things that we have found as new species in the past 20 years are primarily things in this group, the nocturnal things, because many people now are going out looking for them, and they're finding things that they've never seen before. And these are the true lemurs. These are the diurnal lemurs, the things that we call the shafaks. These are the dancing ones, that they never will walk across a road or across a path or a trail. They get on two and then they hop and they look like they're dancing. In fact, my wife and I were a couple of years ago, we were at one of the reserves way up on the northwest coast, and we were in a little area that was a small resort, but a fairly rustic one. And we got our little cottage that was right on the water, right on the Mozambique Channel, and my wife ran in and she said, "You won't believe what's on our deck." And it was these guys. They were just there looking at us. "Oh, welcome." And then this is the Indri. The Indri is the largest of the living lemurs. It's like the size of a panda bear. And it's the one that makes these vocalizations that's sort of described as a hybrid between a railroad, a whale, and a fire engine. It's just really piercing. You can hear it for miles when you're in the forest. And most of the lemurs that I've shown you have actually, many of them can be raised in captivity and they breed successfully. But for some reason, no one anywhere in the world has ever been able to breed the Indri in captivity. That's why there are major efforts afoot as I speak to make sure that the habitats where they occur are actually preserved, because there's no way to try to propagate the species in any kind of an artificial setting. And again, here are more of the true lemurs, the ring-tailed lemurs, crown lemurs, and then the bamboo lemurs. This is, as a matter of fact, this golden bamboo lemur, this is the lemur that I was telling you about that was actually found at that park, Ranamafan National Park. This was actually described only in the late 1980s. And one of the interesting things about these bamboo lemurs is we have 3 of them that can occur in the same forest. And you know, typically, especially in animals, it's very unusual to find closely related species that are occupying the same habitat, because they're all competing for the same resources. But in fact, detailed studies have now been done of these lemurs, and we found that in fact they all feed on bamboo, but they feed on different parts of the bamboo. One species will feed only on the young leaves, another one will feed on the young branches, and another one will feed on the more mature culms. But they're all able to live harmoniously. The other interesting thing is that, especially the new growth in bamboos, it basically is something that's quite poisonous. But these things can actually ingest an amount that would be lethal to humans. But for some reason, they have a digestive system that's able to either capture that, roll it up, and expel it, and nothing happens to them, interestingly enough. This is a comparative number of looking at lemurs and or non-human primates and looking at their distribution worldwide, the countries that have the highest numbers. Look at Madagascar, 84 species. All species, all genera, all families occur only on Madagascar, no place else. The only other place that comes close is Indonesia, and you can see that only 56% of the species that occur there are actually endemic. And then the other high incident countries for non-human primates, Brazil, Peru, and Congo. Let's look at a few of the birds. I told you that there were 5 endemic families of birds. These are some of my favorites: the hoopoe, the cuckoo. Here's, of course, a bird that no living human being has ever seen. It was probably quite abundant when the first people got to Madagascar, and in fact, It was one of the largest birds to ever live. It probably was something like 10 feet tall. It laid an egg that was about this big. And it said that you could get one of those eggs and you could make scrambled eggs for about 50 people. So that's the size of it. As a matter of fact, we have a cast of a skeleton of that bird and an egg actually on display at the Academy if you've not already seen it. But there's a very interesting special that David Attenborough did. David Attenborough, he made a trip to Madagascar in 1960. He was one of the first naturalists to go there after Madagascar opened up to Westerners again. And he became very enthralled with the elephant bird because someone took him to the very southern shore, on the very southern tip of the island, where you can still find the cracked eggshells of this bird. The shell is very thick, but it still litters the sands and dunes. And a child came up to him and gave him what had been pieced together as almost a perfect egg. And back then, you could take the eggs out of the country, so he took it with him. So it's been one of his treasures, one of his natural history treasures that he's kept on his desk at home. And he's produced a movie about the search and what made this particular bird go extinct. And he comes to the conclusion that it's not that it was probably hunted to extinction or that it had any prey, predators that killed it, but he thinks that what happened is people over-harvested the eggs, since the eggs were such a wonderful source of protein, to a point where they could no longer produce, which seems very reasonable when you think about it, with an egg that could produce scrambled eggs for 50 people.
When did it go extinct?
We believe that it went extinct in the 1600s because people like that quote that I gave at the very beginning by Philibert Comberson. He makes no mention in his writings, nor does Grandidier, the other French naturalist who went there. They make no, and they travel the island pretty widely, but they make no mention of having seen anything like that.
So around the same time as the dodos.
About the same time as the dodo, that's correct.
So those were like 300-year-old eggshells.
Exactly, exactly. But remember, I think the reason they've been preserved is they occur on the south coast, which is very dry. It gets very little rain, and it's in a sandy environment that's been covered with sand, so there's nothing to cause them to decay, and they're really thick, really, really thick. Let me show you some of the endemic bird groups, the mesites. Now, I'll try, if I can, to sort of relate these to something that you may know. The mesites is a small group of just a few species, only in Madagascar. We believe that they're related to rails. Rails are not an easy group of birds to see, but if you go to marshy areas, you can see them. We believe that it's actually evolved from a very primitive kind of rail. The ground rollers. This is a really interesting group of birds, especially this one, really colorful. And we believe that these are closely related to the kingfishers. And if you look at some of those with a little stretch, you could make a kingfisher out of that, or out of that. Now this is the real puzzle, the cuckoo roller. We still don't know what this is really related to. It's really been quite a puzzle. There have been a lot of people studying it, but we don't really know what it's related to. It's just one species and one genus in this family.
Is that male and female?
No, that's sorry. It's just two different views of two different birds taken at two different times. As a matter of fact, the female is actually brown, mottled brown with black spots. And the Ascites, those of you who know anything about birds, there are no hummingbirds in the old world. That's a totally new world group. But in different parts of the world, you've had the evolution of bill types that also seek nectar as a source of food. And in fact, this is a group that has done that, the Ascites. The Ascites, however, are not at all related to hummingbirds or any of the other birds that we know that are nectar feeders. In fact, we think that they're related to a group of birds called the pittas. And the pittas, if you do any birding or know anything about birds, the pittas is a group of birds that occur in Asia and Australasia. Not easy to see and not terribly common. This is the group that I really love. It's about 22 species called vangas. And I tell people that if Charles Darwin had gone to Madagascar, he would have thought of the Galapagos finches as small change. Because when you talk about bill morphology, how much more different can you get than something like that versus something like that, or something like that? And we believe that this is a group of birds that radiated in Madagascar from a primitive shrike-like ancestor, because this family is, again, just on Madagascar and no place else. And they occupy habitats all over the island. They're rainforest birds, they're dry forest birds, they're spiny forest birds as well. And this is another great group, the kuas. This is not a family that's restricted to Madagascar, but it's a subfamily called kuani. And this, I guess if you stretch it, you could make a roadrunner out of some of those, because this is in the cuckoo family, and they're related to the roadrunners. I'm just going to show you a sampling of the diversity in the reptiles. Everything from tortoises to really, really interesting geckos. Look at this one. Look at this one. Can you believe that? Almost looks like something a child painted. It looks like a vegetable. Well, if you've ever seen these, you know, this is a group of organisms, especially the chameleons, have become very popular as people like to raise them because they're very easy, they're very tame, they don't bite you. It's the classic example of an animal that's beautifully adapted to move in a forest environment. Look at the feet. It has this sort of lobed foot for grasping. Notice how the body is flattened laterally, so it's very easy for it to move. And notice it has eyes that are in sockets that can move independent of one another. So it can have one eye looking back and one eye looking forward, and that's a way of making sure that it watches out for its potential predators. And they have an enormous tongue. That's only a small part of it there. That tongue is about that long. And that's a way in which they actually size up. With those eyes, they can watch. If they're looking for some food, they can look all around to find a prey item. And when they find it, they get a certain distance, and then they aim, and they get it with that tongue.
It's the little tiny one.
Which one? Sorry. Oh, yes. This is the smallest of the chameleons, and you can see it's in the palm of my hand. It's called Bruchesia, and it's very hard to find because you can see it's not colorful like the others. It's brown, and it usually occurs in the forest floor under leaves. So you have to sort of know how to look for it.
Is that an adult size one?
I'm sorry?
Is that adult size?
That is adult. As a matter of fact, not only was it adult, we realized when we were looking at it closely it was a female and it was pregnant. And of course the frogs are another matter. Everything from things called tomato frogs, as you can see why, to all kinds of other wonderful patterns. I mean, look at that. Just phenomenal. Okay, well, I think that gives you a pretty good cross-section of some of the biodiversity, and you can see that there's a lot of really unique life forms on the island. But there are a lot of threats to the flora and fauna. And the threats are not only those kinds of threats that you see in developing countries generally. You know, I like to think of threats to conservation in developing countries as falling into these categories. Uncontrolled population growth, which is a problem in many developing countries. Poverty. Lack of education, but especially lack of education about natural resources and political instability. In virtually every country that's suffering in terms of conservation, one or more of these factors is in force. Now, the major threats to Madagascar's biodiversity, being more specific, are deforestation and habitat destruction, fires, many of which are deliberately set, erosion and soil degradation, and overexploitation of living resources, hunting and collecting, and mineral resources, mining. There's a lot of mining for semi-precious stones that's going on. So what happens is you get a lot of, for example, in the south of Madagascar now, they've found a lot of semi-precious stones, and what happens is you get people from other parts of the world, people from Thailand, from India that are coming in and actually moving into these towns, setting up shop, buying from the local people who are doing all the mining, and there's no government regulation to determine what can be sold, how much it can be sold for, or whether it can be exported. There has to be better government, but when you have governmental instability, what do you do? And of course, this one, introduction of alien species, is not so much a problem for them as it is for people like us. Our major threats to biodiversity here in California tend to be all these introduced things that have gotten loose, like broom, grasses, and all these sorts of things. They are a problem, but not to the extent that we have to deal with. And let me tell you about the different kinds of forest destruction that are going on in the east. This is an area, this is a photograph I took several years ago from an airplane. That entire area was one time forested. Look what's left. Look at this. And this is the dry season when all of this area now is in grassland and it turns very dry and brown. What happens is they practice what's called slash and burn agriculture, TABI, and it's actually carried out by subsistence farmers. They cut the forest, they dry it, they set fire, and then they grow crops, mostly rice, manioc, and maize, for a period of 1 or 2 years. And then the soil becomes so degraded that they can't grow it anymore, so they have to move to another plot. So it means more forest gets destroyed. What happens is, in the areas that they then abandon after 2 years, you get some degraded vegetation that comes back. So you get what's called a secondary forest, saboka. It regrows on the deforested land, which is normally re-cleared after an average of another 10 years. So this becomes a vicious cycle, and it's repeated, and its repetition actually leads to a deterioration of the soil structure and the nutrient content. And then regrowth of the vegetation really becomes impossible once grassland covers a place like this, because there's no seed source to revegetate. Now, in the west, the western part of the country, the threat is primarily fire, much of which is just deliberately started. And it started not so much because people want to grow crops there, but western Madagascar is really the livestock raising area of the country. And the fires are set each year to really encourage the regrowth of new grass so that the cattle can graze and have something to eat. So it's believed that about 1/3 of the land area of the island is burnt every year, which is a lot. And you have fire, it creates wooded savanna, then you get a sterile grassland that consists of maybe just one or a few species of grasses. And this is a formation that already covers about 75% of the island. And in some areas, the soil has degraded to such an extent that there's no natural vegetation that can come back to that site, because the sources are so far removed that there's no way for any kind of propagules to make their way to that site. Now, let me end by just telling you a little bit about what we at the California Academy of Sciences have been doing in Madagascar. About 15 years ago, we started a program there. Several of our scientists started research programs there, and the activities we do there are really discovering, documenting, using, and protecting biodiversity through research and training and education. We have people from many of our disciplines working there, people working on insects and arthropods. They're actually creating data about long-neglected species for conservation planning. We found that much of the conservation planning that's been done in places like Madagascar has been based on sort of the flagship species, the really beautiful organisms, the mammals and the birds, the really obvious things. But in fact, there are many other organisms that have just been totally ignored. And when you start looking at the distribution of all these other organisms, like the thousands and thousands of insects, their patterns of diversity are very different from those of mammals and birds. And therefore, if you only protect the higher primates or the birds, you're actually losing a lot of the other biodiversity. So what we're doing is providing data of that type so that the government can actually study it and use it to maybe establish new reserves and new parks. We're also doing this with flowering plants. Flowering plants are much easier. They don't move. They're very conspicuous. Everybody loves plants. But what we're doing is we're looking at some of the very diverse families, and we're trying to map these to see if there are any particular areas around the island that are especially rich with certain species density, especially of endemic species. And we're getting some very interesting data in that regard as well. A project that I was involved in for a number of years with colleague chemists and anthropologists, which has just come to an end, was looking at drug discovery. And when I say drug discovery, I should probably not use the word drug, I should say medicinal products. What we were doing was going into the forest, working with the local people, trying to learn how they use the forest as their pharmacy. And we weren't just working with the people who use the plants, we were also looking at what the lemurs were using in the forest. As a matter of fact, we believe that lemurs have been there for millions of years, people only for 2,300 years, and we believe that probably people started observing lemurs and started looking at what lemurs were feeding on, and they also experimented with them. And what we've done is we've created some very massive databases that indicate what species are used by humans and by lemurs. And very often, they're using the same things. Now, we know what people are using them for, but we don't know what lemurs are using them for. One of the interesting things is that lemurs, when they die and autopsies are done on them, we find that lemurs are infected by at least 5 different species of malarial parasites. Yet they never show any symptoms of malaria like humans do. And we don't know whether or not this is a result of the diet that they're selectively seeking out. For some reason, they seem to love members of the mistletoe family, so we think there's something in mistletoes that may be very important. Another thing with the mouse lemurs that I showed you, the little ones, when these animals are brought into captivity after about 12 or 13 years, they show symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And these things have been monitored in the wild, and in the wild they never seem to exhibit anything even approximating Alzheimer's disease. So we're beginning to wonder, is it something in their diet that's allowing them to ward off the onset in the wild versus something that they don't have when they're brought into captivity? But these are all very interesting observations, nevertheless. Another project we've been involved in is working with a team of botanical gardens and our colleagues in Madagascar. One of the things about the flora of Madagascar is it has a number of species that are related to economically important plants. There are dozens of species of coffee in Madagascar, rice, citrus, many other species of vanilla, things like ebony, and many others, many of which have never been tested for their value commercially. But one of the things we're doing is we're now going back, trying to rediscover the natural populations in the wild, map them, and create a database using GIS, so that if in fact there's a need to get new germplasm of things related to coffee or related to vanilla, and from time to time you hear of the coffee crop that gets devastated by a virus or something, this is a way of making sure that you preserve some of the gene pool of related species in the wild. Our marine people have been surveying the status and health of coral reefs, especially off of the west coast, because we find that oil has just been discovered off the Mozambique Channel of Madagascar, and the government is very interested in getting information about the health of their coral reefs because they're interested in trying to make the right decision. People in our aquarium are actually doing a lot of animal husbandry with both the reptiles and the amphibians as well, many of which are doing quite well in captivity. And we've also started a program of training. What we're doing is we are bringing young Malagasy scientists to the academy with support from some foundation grants. Every year we bring young people back, and we either bring them for a period of 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. Some of them are even in degree-seeking programs. We feel that one of the important things about conservation anywhere in developing countries is those of us who go there maybe once a year or twice a year, every or every other year, no matter what we do, it can never have a lasting impact unless you train people on the ground who are going to pass that on to the next generation. They have to become the mentors for the next generation. So what we've been doing for the past 7 or 8 years is bringing people back, and we're training them in just about everything that we can train them. And we're teaching them to do all kinds of things, whether it's pinning insects for a museum, field collecting techniques, databasing, GIS technology, creating taxonomic keys, many of which they even design. I have a couple coming this coming spring where we're teaching them how to write scientific papers so that they will become that next generation who can advise their government. Another thing that we have done is with my colleague Brian Fisher, we have actually built what we call a biodiversity center in the capital city. It becomes the training ground. We use this as the facility that we use when we're mounting expeditions, but we have people there that are resident every day. They're actually doing studies, they're giving tours, they're training people at the local universities. So we think that this has been a transformative kind of thing to help the people in that country move forward for the future. Now, we couldn't have ever done this without a lot of collaborators. This is just a list of some of the people that we've collaborated with over the years. And of course, it all takes money. And we've had the benefit of support from a number of private individuals, National Science Foundation, National Geographic Society, quite a few places. Even Oracle has helped us. But it's all been for a good cause, and like I say, in developed countries, it's always a challenge. My only regret is we'll never live long enough to see what the results of our effort will result in. Thank you very much. Do we have time for a question or two?
I was curious on the slide that was talking about the impacts of fire and basically type conversion. You mentioned at the extreme things, getting to the point of just being grassland and bracken fern. I was wondering which bracken fern is that?
It's the one we have.
It's Pteridium
Pteridium aquilinum.
Okay.
Yeah, you know that's all over the world except Antarctica.
And can be very dense in places. Yeah.
It's really once it gets into a place, there's hardly anything that.
And is that native in Madagascar?
No, it's not native.
Okay.
It was brought in many years ago. We don't know the source of the seed, but you know, it's not only a problem there, it's a problem in tropical areas around the world. I've seen it in places like Brazil where it just takes over. I mean, it's phenomenal. It's sad, but true.
Is it on the roof of the cow cabin?
No.
Not yet. No oxalis yet either, right?
No, we have no oxalis. No, thank goodness.
That's good.
Yes.
So one other plant question on your slide about searching for medicinal plants. There was a picture in the lower left of a flower that looked to me like Madagascar periwinkle.
Yes,
Which
it was.
is a non-native that's found it's found in Florida, I know.
Actually, it's native in Madagascar.
Yeah.
Yeah. But see, that's one of the classic examples of one of the things I should say. I didn't have, I went way over time, but I could have told you a very interesting story. When we started this project about drug discovery, we had funding from the National Institutes of Health, and because there's been this history of developing nations sort of pirating resources like that around the world, countries now have become very sensitive. So it's become increasingly difficult for scientists from developing countries to go to underdeveloped countries to do this kind of work, because they think automatically, oh, you want genetic material, we know what you want it for, and you will use it, you will develop an important drug, and then we will get nothing. And in fact, rosy periwinkle is something that originated, it's native in southern Madagascar, and it was taken out of the country, and it's been used for childhood leukemia, and Madagascar's never seen a dime from any of that, because it's so easily grown and it's naturalized. Like you say, it's all over Florida. I remember I grew up in Florida. It was as a kid, my grandmother had it all over her garden.
Yeah, it's a popular garden plant.
It is very popular.
I didn't know it had medical value.
Oh yeah, very much so.
So what started off the work or just...
Right. Yeah.
So no one was growing everywhere in Florida. I mean, just...
And the Malagasy government has never demanded that they get something back from this, but it's been a. So one can understand why developing countries now have become extremely sensitive to these sorts of things, and they want to control what goes out. So, to get back to the point I was trying to make, the National Institutes of Health now makes it so difficult for even researchers here in our own country. It means that you have to go through this very lengthy process of hiring attorneys for people in your host country. So everybody we worked with was represented by attorneys who could make sure that their best interest and their intellectual property rights were being guarded. And one can understand why this is the case.
Cells of furry and alive.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, of a different kind. Okay, thank you.